API Intersection podcast listeners are invited to sign up for Stoplight and save up to $650. Use the code Intersection10 to get 10% off a new subscription to Stoplight Platform Starter or Pro. Take a look at this episode's description for more details.
I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Welcome back to API Intersection. So we've had a couple of guests on before where we kind of talk about, consuming APIs from lots of different things is hard, and how can we make that easier, which I think we can all sympathize with, or, have some experience of trying to integrate too many things and having it all fall apart. So I'm looking forward to, sharing some of the learning from Eric Yu from Rutter. Eric, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you guys do at Rutter.
Yeah, I'm Eric. I'm one of the co-founders of Rutter. We've been around for, I think, 2 years at this point. Basically, we're a universal API aggregator for a lot of different kinds of business software, e-commerce platforms like Shopify and Amazon, accounting systems like Xero and QuickBooks, and then some payment systems like Stripe and PayPal and Chargebee. And so we standardize all of those APIs into kind of a unified format so that people don't have to read, 20 different kinds of documentation. And then we just make that one API to work with.
Got it. What do typical kind of customers look like for you guys as far as who's looking to integrate with all the different things?
Yeah, I would say for us, it falls into two main buckets. One is basically more focused on e-commerce. So a lot of e-commerce ecosystem apps like marketing tools and new ways to, like marketplaces, new places to sell stuff. They use our e-commerce APIs to like get products, create orders, all of those things. And then the other big segment of customers is on the FinTech side, where they want to get access to a lot of this business data in e-commerce platforms and in accounting platforms to basically get like a better view of the company and the financial health of the company to use in underwriting or like lending or credit cards, all kinds of different use cases there.
Got it. I always like to kind of learn from folks that, kind of have the moxie to go found something. Like, what got you to this point? What got you thinking about trying to solve these problems? And I don't know, this might sound jerky, but like, why should our community of listeners take your ideas seriously?
Yeah, definitely. That we've been through many ideas that definitely should not be taken seriously. So we started out basically in YC doing something completely different. It was a dev tool for translation, actually, like a kind of an internationalization tool. We then basically built that, realized some things weren't working, and started pivoting for a long time. Kind of wandered the desert for like 2 years, trying to figure things out. And I think eventually for us, because my co-founder and I are both engineers, we had been kind of building these different apps that required integrations into other tools, and realized at some point that we were doing the same thing over and over again. We had seen what was happening in the space with new universal APIs like payroll ones, and of course Plaid that did this for banking, and felt that we could just try to do one for e-commerce platforms, and that's kind of where we started. And so we did that. Weren't entirely sure who would use it at the beginning, but we then kind of reached out to many, many different kinds of developers on the Shopify App Store to see who was interested in getting their app on other platforms, and found some of these customer segments that I mentioned, and then went from there.
Got it. Yeah, it's interesting, this notion of like aggregation platforms around APIs to sort of address, the diversity of consistency that you experience. Seems like there's kind of this pick a segment and be good at it. But the idea that you can be good at all the things is too broad, and that there's been, not a lot of big success stories that came out of that. And I love that you mentioned Plaid. I feel like that's That's the thing that's kind of inspired everyone to try to go solve this in particular sort of verticals. It's interesting. So, I already started hinting at, I guess, the things I've heard before, but I'm curious from your perspective, like, what's hard about trying to integrate with multiple providers in terms of consuming those APIs and, the engineering challenges it presents?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of challenges when it comes to integrating with many different APIs, but I would say probably the two biggest ones for me are one, dealing with generally speaking, there's definitely some APIs out there that are more tech forward, and companies that are more tech forward, like Shopify has a great API. So those are pretty straightforward to do. But then when you have to, make them work with APIs that are like more nightmarish, like Amazon's API that uses like reports to get data, async requests that take minutes to finish instead of like a few seconds to finish. That's when you run into challenges standardizing the APIs. So that's a huge problem. And then secondly, when you deal with these APIs and fetch data like we are and kind of like standardizing it, you have to deal with many different kinds of rate limits, and building a system that can handle a lot of these different errors, permission errors, rate limit errors, transient errors for these APIs. It takes a lot to basically maintain that system.
Yeah, that's the bit where I think, we talked a lot on the show here to folks that like build APIs, right? They're running some sort of program. And, we talk a ton about, what's important. And it's like, design and language and, some of these scaling factors and all that. But it's like, what are the errors like? How many times does that come up? Not very often. And it probably should be a lot more. So it's interesting, though, that on one hand, you're having to sort of consolidate what is sort of a model to represent this concept across multiple things. And then on the other side is how do you present the flow of errors in sort of a consistent fashion? Seems like two pretty different problem spaces, though.
Yeah, definitely. I think we spent a lot of time on both ones, and I think for the first one with the consolidation and standardization of information, that's really just a lot of iteration. Like you basically just start with the most simple to use API and kind of go from there. And then when you talk to different users and they want more fields or they want to change certain things, that's kind of how you learn eventually kind of what the ideal output looks like. So it's definitely kind of a process of learning for us. I think on the error side, yeah, we spent a lot of time working with various errors. I think some APIs they've sent us errors where some of the messages have been in different languages. So like a Dutch error message saying that you can't access the store's permission. We've had to kind of learn over time how to handle all of those.
Yeah, the error message that tells you you've selected the wrong language.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's an intriguing spot to be in that you go, okay, I've looked at all these different sort of data models that these different APIs provide. And, it's like the meta design problem of how do you come up with something good? It's like, your worst problem in that scenario is that you end up producing something that is the sum of all of its parts that's worse than any one of them. So from a kind of API design perspective, how do you guys think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think for us, a big part of this is just learning, and so we start with kind of what is the gold standard. So, for example, e-commerce API's gold standard is Shopify, and we use that as kind of a skeleton, and then we basically figure out. We try to not include too many fields because it's kind of overwhelming for people to like learn what all the fields mean. But over time, we do add some based off of user feedback. So we try to basically make it more and more useful. But as you mentioned, like you also just can't dump everything in there. And so the way that we've kind of got around this is we allow our users of the API to also get direct access to some of these underlying APIs that we're connected to. We give them the tokens. And so that allows them in certain situations where they need to make direct calls or get something unique or specific to them, make a direct call to the Shopify or Amazon API and do what they need to do. So we try to make as much standardization as possible. But then for some off cases, we allow the flexibility of like using the API directly.
Yeah, no, I think it's like when folks think about these things, I'm always like, take the least common denominator approach. the least number of common things. Don't try to do the mash them all together to get all the things, because that's never going to work out. So, I mean, you mentioned like rate limiting and some of these things. I also think about like, one of the consumption problems folks run into a lot is sort of almost hardwiring their infrastructure to some external API. And then when it goes down, everything just, totally falls apart. And so this kind of availability factor, like sort of the, buffer for that, like, are you guys providing anything like that? And then I guess what would your sort of recommendations on the right ways to approach those things be?
Yeah, I think for us, what we do is we actually take in all the data from these different APIs and then store it and then standardize it on our end. So we're making that available directly through our database to our users. So the good thing is that if an API goes down, let's say like Shopify or one of these other platforms, people can still fetch data from us. We just won't be able to kind of update that while the other API is down. And also post requests won't work because we can't make those requests to the external API. So I think that's actually a tactic that a lot of consumers of APIs use. We've talked to people who've built integrations with QuickBooks and Shopify, these different platforms, and they do something similar where they store the data to avoid downtime, but also to avoid some of the rate limits of kind of refetching the data over and over again. So that's a big thing that we do.
So here's I don't want to call it a hot take, but probably a contentious question to ask someone in your position. But like, I've been in software a long time, since 90s .com bubble, right? And seen these kind of trends come and go of like an industry standardizing on one thing. And I look in modern era to like in, say, healthcare, you got like the Fire API spec, right? Like, do you see that like some more of these kind of verticals might start moving toward standardizing on things, and is that like what we should be doing, and or do you think folks like yourself are leading the way toward that?
Yeah, it's that. Yeah, I mean that's a super interesting question. I think from what I've seen, there like whereas in other fields, I've also noticed. Yeah, I think in messaging and communication, there's been kind of these more standard protocols and APIs to use Messenger, iMessage, all of those things. We haven't seen the same thing develop yet in the e-commerce world or the accounting world. So I don't think there's like a body that's kind of leading that effort. I think like from what we see, it's definitely more similar to the banking where it's been more fragmented, and unless kind of a body steps in, there won't be much unification. And I think in the e-commerce and accounting world, there's no like government that's wanting to come in and help out there. So for now, I think like for us, we're kind of trying to do the work to make people's lives easier. But if there is kind of a body that kind of steps in to deliver some additional value or standardization, I think we'd make use of that, and then just kind of look for other places where there's not that and try to be a universal API.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in this particular kind of vertical. I mean, I will say that like, sure, governments can step in and regulate things, and that is certainly a source of why people would do these things. Sort of portability, interoperability in some areas can be like a driver that's more organic, or that companies will come together around. But it's hard to imagine a world in which e-commerce driven platforms come together and agree on one way to do things. They're all trying to differentiate themselves, so
Yeah.
it seems unlikely.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people go, well, it's an API and you get the data, like let's make it all standard. But the differentiators are expressed in that API, right? So like, unless they all have some homogeneous, consistent offering, then that's pretty unlikely, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So in sort of working in this e-commerce space and APIs, you're dealing with some huge platforms, right? With millions of developers involved. And I mean, I've, like I worked at PayPal for a while and got a taste for what that's like, right? And it's hard to know sometimes what you're doing right or wrong. And I'm curious from your perspective, when you look at all these different APIs, like what do you think these API providers could be doing differently that would make that experience better for everyone?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about this because I've seen so many kind of like difficult APIs to work with. Um, I would say I think generally speaking, the APIs that we struggle to work with the most are the ones that are they still really haven't adopted kind of like more modern standards like REST or and basically JSON. Sometimes we work with a lot of XML APIs that, if you're a new developer familiar with JSON and new APIs, trying to integrate something that has an XML SOAP API is just like, that's just something else. So I think keeping up with kind of the standards of API is something that like we'd really like to see people do. And then generally, I think documentation is super important for us. It's super important. We spend a lot of time just like making sure everything is up to date. The worst thing for us is looking at an API's documentation, trying it out, and then realizing that it's like not what's written there, and being like, oh my god, now I have to figure out like let me just figure out like from scratch how this whole API works. So that's also a big deal and something that we actually do see like out there in the world.
It's funny. I can't help but reflect. I've been, doing this API stuff for a long time that if I'd asked this question in like 2012, I bet I'd get the same answer.
Yeah.
I'm tired of the SOAP and XML stuff. This new REST thing looks like it's a lot better to work with. And can we move to JSON because XML stinks to work with? And, quit sending me PDFs with old specs.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Some things never change. And it's
Yeah.
hard to believe that in 2022 coming into 23, like we're still dealing with a lot of SOAP and XML stuff. It's hard to believe.
Yeah, I was honestly surprised by some of that as well. I think some companies maybe they just have something that's working and they don't really want to update it. But of course, that kind of the trade off is that you won't see a lot of new development in your ecosystem. So I think people are kind of still trying to adjust.
Yeah, for sure. API development is not cheap. I don't mean to be disrespectful to anybody. And hey, if you're making money and it works, why change it? I get it, but it's interesting though on the docs that you point out, just simple accuracy. Just like, do the docs actually reflect what the thing does?
Yeah.
It's remarkable, and I think the advent of like open API and these kinds of things, giving you a way to sort of generate documentation based on the spec that you also use to generate your implementation. Seems to have been the thing that's made that better, broadly speaking.
Hmm.
But even then, within examples and guides and things, it could still be off. So yeah, it's hard. I'm curious in kind of, you're dealing with a lot of this sort of the financial component here and not necessarily payments specifically, but I'm
Hmm.
curious with, the FinTech space has just been really frothy the last few years and lots of kind of API approaches to those things. Like, what are you seeing in kind of the direction of where all that stuff is going and what's interesting to you?
Yeah, I think at least where we're positioned kind of in the fintech world. The fintech world is so big and growing so quickly. I would say I think like consumer fintech was definitely revolutionized like a few years ago because Plaid basically made banking data and access to banks available to a lot of other apps, so that like changed the game definitely. And I think now different people are catching up, and I think in Europe there's open banking as well. So like the need for the aggregator is like a lot less now. I would say something similar is definitely happening in the business/commercial realm of things. So when it comes to business lending, versus consumer lending, or kind of business financial software tools versus like consumer kind of like personal financial tools. I think there's a lot of development going there because there's a lot of neobanks as well and kind of like spend management tools like Ramp and Brex and all of that stuff. So all of these kind of business management tools or business financial tools require some level of access to business data, whether it's accounting or e-commerce data or payments data. And so that's where we've been basically operating and we see a lot of growth there.
Yeah, very interesting. I guess what are some examples of, I think you maybe named one in there, but like, what are some
Yeah.
examples of things?
Yeah, I would say, for example, I think a big one is business lending. I think during COVID as well, there was like a big period where people were offering SMB loans, PPP loans to help out
Mm,
businesses, and a lot of underwriting is being done. And I think a lot of companies want to underwrite faster with better data. So that's where getting access to QuickBooks financial statements or Stripe revenue numbers, like that's where that's helpful. Um, I think you might have seen some new startups where they're able to kind of convert your MRR into ARR and these kinds of like financial products. And that's they also need to underwrite on some subscriptions data or some financial data as well. And then I think the other thing that we've been seeing is we work with a company called Ramp that provides credit cards to companies, and they also need to underwrite how much credit to give to a company, which also requires data. So we also help out there.
hmm, very interesting. Well, Eric, any other closing thoughts here for us on API aggregation, e-commerce, FinTech? We covered a lot of things here. Any other thoughts for listeners here?
Yeah, I think I mean, I think we covered a lot, but generally the process of building APIs is tough. Learning all these different kinds of documentations and formats. And so I think for us, a big part of what we're doing is that, but also being able to scale, because maybe like someone would go look at an aggregator and be like, I can build 10 APIs even if they're all different pretty quickly. But for us, the goal is to eventually hit 100, 200, 500 APIs, and that's kind of the more that we have, the more value we deliver. So a big part of our system is just being able to scale our APIs and kind of repeatedly generate scaffolding, templating to allow our team to ship new integrations quickly. So that's a big part of what we do as well, and a way that we want to help.
Very cool. Well, thanks again, Eric, for joining us and sharing so much about what you guys do at Rutter.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason, for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.